The first tear in the veil made a sound too small for the number of people who had come to hear it. Clara Thorne stood on the cedar steps of Bitter Creek Church, with the afternoon sun burning through the crown of her hat and the taste of dust between her teeth. Deacon Jedediah Vance held the edge of her wedding veil between his thumb and forefinger. His hand was broad, brown at the knuckles, and stained with the blue-black ink he used for church accounts. Behind him, half the town had gathered in a white glare of shirt sleeves, bonnets, black coats, and carefully blank faces. The veil had come from Philadelphia in a cedar box 2 months before her father died. Thomas Thorne had complained about the expense, then carried the box himself from the freight wagon, as if it contained a newborn child. Clara remembered his smile when she lifted the lace against the window. He had said it made the room look softer. Nothing about Bitter Creek looked soft now. "A promise," Deacon Vance said, pitching his voice so it carried to the hitching rail, "is not private property. A promise binds households. It binds a church. It binds a valley." Clara watched a fly circle the deacon's collar. She counted the flowers woven into the lace instead of looking at Silas Montgomery, who stood near the front of the crowd in a clean black coat. 1 flower, 3, 8, 13. Her father had taught her to count when fear made the room narrow. Count floorboards, count stitches, count breaths. Anything could become a railing if you held it hard enough. She had broken no promise in the way Vance meant. She had refused to marry a man after finding a death certificate in Silas's clinic that did not match what she had seen on the operating table. The patient, a ranch hand named Peter Cole, had not died from a sudden weakness of the heart. Silas had given him too much morphine after ignoring the man's failing breath. Clara had been there. She had tried to tell him. Silas had sent her from the room. The next morning, the paper said heart failure and bore the deacon's witness mark. In Bitter Creek, facts became sins if the wrong person spoke them. The deacon tore the veil. The lace split from Clara's temple to her shoulder. A few women lowered their eyes. Someone's baby began to fuss and was quickly hushed. Silas did not move. The ceremony was called the unveiling. It was older than Clara, older than the church building, perhaps older than anyone could honestly remember. The town used it on women accused of adultery, theft from kin, or what the deacon liked to call moral abandonment. No sheriff stood there. No law book was opened. Yet everyone understood the punishment. After the veil was torn, doors would close. Credit would vanish. Invitations would stop. A woman could live in Bitter Creek and still become socially dead. One elder after another stepped forward. Mrs. Pike, who had once borrowed Clara's blue china for her daughter's wedding, removed a strip from the back. Mr. Finch, the grocer who ate roast goose at Thomas Thorne's table every Christmas, plucked away a loose panel without meeting Clara's eyes. By the time the last piece fell, sweat had flattened Clara's hair to her neck. She looked at the town and understood something that hurt more than the tearing. No one seemed surprised. They had already agreed to this before she arrived. Silas finally stepped closer when the deacon finished. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His expression was mild, almost sorrowful. The expression he wore when telling a family that a patient had died despite his best efforts. "You can still come home from this," he said quietly. Clara looked at him then. There had been a time when his gray eyes seemed calm to her, reliable. He was 10 years older, already established as a physician, already treated by Bitter Creek as a man whose opinion could close an argument. After her father grew ill, Silas had begun calling almost every evening. He brought tea, medical journals, oranges from California. He listened when she spoke about Thomas's decline. He offered to take over patients her father could no longer visit. When he proposed, Clara had mistaken management for kindness. Now she saw calculation in the same stillness she had once admired. "I have no home with you," she said. The deacon made a noise of disgust. Silas only smiled with one corner of his mouth. "You will reconsider." Clara stepped down from the church porch. The crowd opened without anyone appearing to move. A corridor formed between bodies that would not acknowledge her. She walked through it alone, past horses shifting under flies, past the trough where sunlight flashed on green water, past the bakery window, where a loaf she had ordered that morning sat cooling on a board. No one called after her. At home, she found a strip of the veil caught on the hook of her dress. She put it on the kitchen table beside the kerosene lamp and sat until the square of light from the western window slid across the floor and disappeared. Her father's house had never seemed large when he was alive. Now every room had an echo. His medical office stood 20 yards away beyond the herb garden, its shutters closed. Dried mint hung from rafters in the kitchen. A copper kettle ticked as it cooled. The house smelled faintly of lavender soap, old books, and the carbolic acid that had worked its way into the floorboards over 30 years of medicine. 3 hard knocks sounded at the back door. Before she could rise, Silas entered. He removed his gloves finger by finger and placed them beside the veil fragment. He smelled of tobacco, bay rum, and disinfectant. "You should lock that door now," he said. "People misunderstand invitations after a woman has been marked." Clara stayed seated. "Did you come to threaten me or advise me?" "I came to save what can still be saved." He took a folded paper from his inner pocket and smoothed it on the table. His handwriting was precise, almost beautiful. Clara read the first lines and felt her stomach tighten. It was a statement concerning Peter Cole's death. According to the paper, Clara had prepared the morphine solution. Clara had misread the dosage. Clara, grieving and emotionally unstable after her father's illness, had concealed the error. Dr. Silas Montgomery had discovered the mistake too late. "You want me to confess to killing him. I want you to put an end to something that will otherwise destroy both of us." "It will not destroy both of us." Silas's jaw moved once. "Your father kept notes," he said. "Your father kept notes about everything. He distrusted other physicians because he could not bear that the town no longer depended entirely on him. I tolerated it out of respect. But you are taking fragments of an old man's bitterness and turning them into accusations." Clara looked at his hands. They were resting flat on the table, but the tendons stood out at his wrists. "Peter was breathing when you sent me out. Peter was dying. You gave him another dose after I told you his breathing had slowed. You were upset. I counted." For the first time, something sharp entered Silas's face. He leaned toward her. "Sign the statement. I will speak to Vance. The shunning will end. We will marry quietly. We can leave Arizona if that makes it easier for you. St. Louis, perhaps. Somewhere no one knows this unpleasantness. And Peter Cole will remain dead whether you make a martyr of yourself or not." That sentence decided something in her. Clara picked up the veil fragment. Silas watched, perhaps expecting tears. Instead, she lifted the glass chimney from the lamp and dropped the lace toward the flame. It caught at once. For half a second, the silk glowed orange, fine threads curling inward, then collapsed into a black edge of ash. The smell was bitter and chemical. Silas stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. "You have no idea what you are doing. I know exactly what I am not doing. By morning, no shop will sell to you. No household will hire you. No man will stand on this porch after dark and risk being seen. You think principals will warm this house in January?" Clara replaced the lamp chimney with careful hands. "Then I suppose we will find out." Silas stared at her for a long moment. The civilized expression left his face completely. 3 days, he said. "That is how long stubbornness usually lasts once hunger becomes involved." He took his gloves and left. The next morning, Clara carried a short list to Finch's Mercantile. The bell above the door rang as she entered. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather harness, smoked ham, and linseed oil. Men stood around barrels near the stove even though the day was already warm. Mrs. Coyle examined bolts of cloth. 2 ranch hands were playing checkers on an upturned crate. When Clara crossed the threshold, every conversation stopped. Then, one by one, people turned their backs. No one laughed, no one cursed. The silence was more deliberate than cruelty shouted aloud. Arthur Finch stood behind the oak counter, polishing the same glass jar again and again. Clara placed her list in front of him. Flour, salt, lard, kerosene, dried beans. She set down a silver dollar. Finch kept polishing. Arthur, his hand paused. Clara waited. The muscles in his throat moved, but he did not look at her. She understood. He had a wife, a store made of dry pine, 2 daughters, and a loan carried by a bank whose directors included Silas's uncle. Cowardice did not always wear a cruel face. Sometimes it looked tired and ashamed. Clara picked up the coin. "Tell Anna I hope her cough has improved," she said. Finch's eyes closed. She walked out with nothing. On the road home, shutters shifted as she passed. A woman she had helped during a difficult birth crossed to the other side of the street. Boys near the livery stopped throwing stones at a fence and watched her with bright, fascinated eyes. At the Thorne property, Clara knew something was wrong before she reached the gate. The door to her father's office hung crooked from one hinge. Inside, destruction glittered in the sunlight. Medicine bottles had been swept from shelves. Tincture of iodine stained the floorboards brown. Green and amber glass lay crushed beneath boots. Her father's German steel instruments had been bent with a hammer. A porcelain mortar she had used since childhood was broken into 3 large pieces and a dozen smaller ones. Drawers had been dumped. Papers covered the floor like dead birds. Clara stood in the doorway with one hand against the frame. There was no reason to ask who had done it. The sheriff would say he had no witnesses. Deacon Vance would call it a regrettable expression of public feeling. Silas would look concerned. She fetched a broom. For 2 hours she worked without crying. She swept glass into a bucket. She separated ruined bandages from clean ones. She wrapped the bent instruments in canvas. She found one intact bottle of carbolic acid under a cabinet and put it aside. A small tin of potassium permanganate had survived in the back of a drawer. So had a lancet, 3 needles, a coil of linen thread, and a concave examination mirror no larger than her palm. Useful things, she thought. The idea startled her. Not sentimental things, useful things. By evening she had cleared a path across the floor. The room would never be restored as it had been, but the act of cleaning changed the meaning of the wreckage. The vandals had tried to desecrate her father's life. Instead, they had forced her to choose what was worth carrying. She was washing her hands at the pump when she heard horses. Elias and Caleb Montgomery rode up the road at a walking pace. Elias, the older brother, carried a wooden crate across his saddle. Caleb smiled as if they were delivering a wedding gift. Neither entered the yard. Elias dismounted at the fence and lifted a lantern from the crate. Its glass had been painted dark red. Clara dried her hands on her skirt. "What is that?" Elias fastened the lantern to the gatepost with a chain. "Town notice. There is no town law allowing you to mark my property." Didn't say there was. He struck a match. The wick caught. Red light bloomed even before sunset. Caleb remained mounted, watching her. "A red lantern means an unprotected house," Clara said. Elias gave her a look almost gentle in its contempt. "Then you understand it." They worked down the fence line, placing another lantern every 20 yards. Each was chained and padlocked to a post. Clara remembered the stories told in whispers when she was young. A red lantern was supposed to warn respectable families away from houses of vice, but Bitter Creek had adapted the old custom. A marked woman had no expectation of help. Men could pound on her door after dark. Creditors could take liberties. Property damage became a private matter. The lantern did not legalize violence. It simply announced that no one would interfere. Across the road, Arthur Finch stood in his barn doorway. Clara met his eyes. This time he looked back. Then he lowered his head. When the Montgomery brothers rode away, red lights ringed her land. Clara took a stone from beside the pump and went to the gate. The railway lantern was made for storms. Its glass was thick. Reinforced with wire, she struck it once. The metal cage rang. Twice. On the third blow, the stone slipped. Her knuckles scraped the hot housing. Pain flashed white through her hand. She jerked back with a cry. The smell of scorched skin mixed with kerosene. Blisters rose almost immediately along 2 fingers. She stood in the red glow, breathing hard. Then she began to laugh. It was not amusement. It was the sound a person made when an absurdity became too complete to hold silently. Bitter Creek had taken a church ritual, railway hardware, family debt, gossip, and medical fraud and built a machine designed to make one woman marry the man she feared. Clara stopped laughing. She went inside, bandaged her hand, and locked the door. Silas returned the following evening in a dark wool coat, carrying a small leather book. He found Clara on the porch with a blanket over her knees. Frost had begun to silver the low grass. The red lanterns threw dull crimson patches across the yard. "I told you winter changes calculations," he said. He sat without invitation and placed the book beside her. Inside was not an account ledger, but a schedule. 6 o'clock rise, 7 breakfast, 9 to 11 approved household reading, no correspondence without review, no medical practice, no discussion of Thomas Thorne's case notes. A list of people she would not visit appeared on the next page. Another page described the house Silas had arranged in Missouri, down to the color of the curtains in the front room. Clara turned pages slowly. "You wrote my days before I agreed to live them. I wrote structure. You have had too little of it since your father died. You wrote a prison. I wrote safety." He tapped the book with one finger. "You will not survive here alone. Finch will not sell to you. The weather will close the pass within weeks, and those lanterns will attract men who are less patient than I am." Clara looked toward the fence. "Your brothers put them there. The town did. Your brothers carried the crate, because someone had to, and you are offering protection from the danger your family created." Silas sighed as if she were a child refusing medicine. I am offering you a way out of a situation you created when you broke our engagement and accused me of things you do not understand. He stood. 3 days, Clara. I will come with a carriage. Pack what matters. And if I am not here, something passed through his expression too quickly to name. You will be. After he left, Clara carried the leather schedule into her father's study and fed it page by page into the stove. Then she knelt beside the oak desk. Thomas Thorne had possessed several nervous habits. He drummed 2 fingers on tabletops. He sharpened pencils with a scalpel. When Silas called unexpectedly during the last year of Thomas's life, he tapped the toe of his boot against one particular floorboard. Clara had noticed because she noticed everything about her father near the end. She found the board by candlelight. A seam near the molding was darker than the others. Using a fire poker, she pried it loose. Beneath lay a shallow cavity lined with oiled cloth. 3 leather-bound journals rested inside. Clara sat on the floor and opened the first. Her father's handwriting filled every page. Names, symptoms, doses, outcomes, weather, family histories, arguments with other physicians. Thomas had recorded 30 years of frontier medicine with a precision that was almost severe. Near the end, the notes changed. Silas Montgomery appeared again and again, Peter Cole. Excess morphine after respiratory distress was already observed. Samuel Reed, age 7. Laudanum dosage questioned. Child unresponsive within the hour. Margaret Evans. Obstructed labor. Delayed intervention. Physician absent during critical period. Sarah Bell, surgical bleeding concealed as heart palsy. Deacon Vance present during alteration of account. There were not dozens of deaths, as panic might have imagined. There were fewer than that, which somehow made them worse. Each case was specific. Each had a name, a family, a time of day. Some were mistakes that any doctor might make in a hard country. What damned Silas was what followed. Altered notes, intimidation, refusal to admit uncertainty, pressure on witnesses, and the repeated participation of men whose standing depended on the town, believing its young physician was infallible. Then Clara found her own name. She read those pages twice. Thomas had noted Silas's interest in her months before the proposal. He described it clinically. Possessiveness disguised as concern, repeated attempts to isolate Clara from medical work, irritation when she disagreed in front of patients. One entry, dated 2 weeks before Thomas's final illness, was underlined. If I die before this is settled, C must not be left dependent on M. He does not seek partnership, he seeks custody. Clara pressed her knuckles to her mouth. For months she had wondered why her father had become withdrawn toward Silas. She had blamed pain, pride, the bitterness of a physician forced to watch a younger man take his place. No, Thomas had been afraid. A soft sound came from outside. Clara closed the journal. Not hoofbeats, not boots, a hiss, then another. She carried the lamp to the back window. One of the red lanterns had gone dark. A tall figure stood at the fence with a wet wool cloth in his hands. Clara opened the door but did not step out. She knew him by sight. Everyone in Bitter Creek did. Chado Nizoni had worked at different times as a scout, guide, translator, horsebreaker, and the subject of half the town's worst stories. He was White Mountain Apache, perhaps in his late 30s, though the lines at the corners of his eyes made age difficult to judge. He wore weather-darkened buckskin and a felt hat with no decoration. A pale scar ran from the edge of his left cheek toward his jaw. He moved to the next lantern, covered its vents with the damp cloth, and waited. The flame died for lack of air. He did not break the chains. He did not need to. One by one, the red lights vanished. When he reached the porch, he held out a lantern that had cooled enough to touch. "They can light them again," Clara said. Yes, his voice was low and rough, without the theatrical solemnity Bitter Creek assigned to him. "Then why do this? Because tonight they do not get to watch you sleep." Clara had no answer. Chado looked past her into the house. "You found your father's books." Her hand tightened on the door. "How do you know?" "Montgomery knows. Men who are afraid of paper watch doors more carefully than men afraid of guns. What do you want? To leave before his brother's return. That does not answer me." For the first time, his eyes met hers fully. "There is a basin beyond Eagle's Rib. People live there who do not belong to Bitter Creek and do not ask permission from it. The trail is hard, harder in cold weather. I can take you. For the journals, partly." She almost shut the door. Chado did not move. "Your father's notes contain land surveys hidden inside medical routes," he said. "Names of families moved from valleys, wells closed by ranch claims. Places where soldiers were told there were no settlements when there were. I need some of that. Others do too. Clara thought of Thomas riding for days to see patients in places Bitter Creek called empty country. And if I refuse, then I leave. No threat, no bargain wrapped in rescue. That unnerved her more than pressure would have. You would let me stay here? It is your house. She stared at him. Silas had never once said those words. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a dry whisper. Somewhere down the valley, a dog barked twice. Clara went inside and returned with the journals wrapped in oilcloth. I do not give these to you, she said. Not yet. Chato nodded. You carry them, and you swear you will take me through the canyon. You will not abandon me if I slow you. You will not hand me to Silas for money or favor. She reached into the pantry jar at the door and poured coarse salt into her palm. Chato looked at the crystals, then at her. My father used salt when he hired men he did not know, Clara said. He said a promise made over something needed by every living thing should cost shame to break. Chato placed his hand over hers. The grains pressed sharply between their palms. I will take you as far as the basin or as far as I can still walk, he said. That is not the same promise. It is the only honest one. Clara considered him, then closed her fingers around the salt. Good. She had 1 hour. Inside, she ignored the silver tea service, her mother's china, framed portraits, books she had loved as a girl. She packed dried apples, a blanket, matches, 2 canteens, her father's surviving medical kit, spare stockings, a small sewing roll, and the last piece of hard cheese in the pantry. The journals were too heavy and square to carry comfortably. In the corner of the bedroom lay her wedding dress, never worn beyond fittings. After the unveiling, she had thrown it there and shut the door. Now she spread the silk across the bed. She placed the 3 journals in the center, folded the dress around them, and tore strips from the hem to bind the bundle. The work would have horrified the seamstress who spent 6 weeks on the gown. Clara felt only relief. The silk finally had a useful purpose. Before leaving, she stood in the kitchen with her lamp turned low. She thought she should say goodbye to the house. Nothing came, so she blew out the flame and walked into the dark. Chato waited beyond the drainage ditch with 1 pack horse. They avoided the road and moved through waist-high grass, silvered by moonlight. Clara's heart beat so loudly she was sure it could be heard across the valley. A low whistle stopped her. Chato dropped to 1 knee. Clara copied him. Hoofbeats approached from the Montgomery Ranch Road. Elias and Caleb appeared between the mesquite, riding slowly. A lantern hung from Elias's saddle. The 2 men stopped less than 30 yards away. Silas says keep her in that house, Elias muttered. 3 days without flour will do more than a sermon. Caleb laughed under his breath. And if she does not soften, then he was wrong about her. He hates being wrong. Their horses shifted, nostrils working at the cold air. Clara's breath came faster. Chato reached for her hand and pressed her palm against the front of his vest. His heartbeat was steady. Not slow from fearlessness, she realized. Slow because he had trained it slow. He inhaled through his nose, held it, released. Clara matched him. Again. The panic in her chest loosened enough for her to hear the horses rather than her own blood. After a minute, Elias moved on. Chato kept Clara still until the lantern was gone. Then they crossed the last fence. At dawn, Bitter Creek was a brown smear behind them. Clara's boots were already hurting. By mid-morning, pain had spread from her toes to her hips. Her travel skirt caught every thorn. The corset under her jacket kept her upright but would not let her breathe deeply on the climb. Chato moved ahead without appearing to hurry. He never asked whether she could continue. Each time she fell behind, he simply altered his pace by a fraction. At the base of a steep basalt slope, Clara tripped over a root and went down on 1 knee. She stayed there longer than she meant to. Chato waited 10 paces above. Do not say it, she muttered. I said nothing. Your face did. My face said your clothes are trying to kill you. Clara looked down at the skirt spread around her in red dust. She began to laugh again, this time because he was right. Her hand went out. Knife. Chato's eyebrows lifted slightly. Knife, she repeated. He handed it hilt first. Clara cut the skirt at mid-calf. Silk, wool, lining, and decorative trim fell away in heavy strips. She removed 2 petticoats entirely. Then she reached behind herself and sawed through the lower corset laces. The first full breath hurt. The second made her dizzy. She used torn fabric to wrap her ankles and the tops of her boots. When she stood, her legs felt indecently exposed to the air and wonderfully free to move. Chato took back the knife. Better. That is all you have to say? You want me to mourn the dress? No. Then better is enough. They climbed. Behind them in Bitter Creek, Silas Montgomery discovered the dark lanterns before sunrise. He entered the Thorn house and went directly to the study. The loose floorboard told him everything. The hollow beneath it was empty. For perhaps 10 seconds, Silas stood absolutely still. Then he began building a story. By the time Deacon Vance arrived in a buggy, Silas had loosened his collar and put dust on one knee. He met the deacon on the porch, looking exhausted. "She's gone," he said. Vance stared at the dark fence. "Gone where?" "Taken." Silas let the word settle, the Apache scout shadow. "I warned her that these men watch isolated houses. God forgive me, I should have stayed." The deacon's face changed exactly as Silas expected. A shunned woman could not inspire a rescue party. A stolen Christian woman could. Within an hour, the church bell was ringing. Men who had turned their backs on Clara at the mercantile saddled horses to save her. Women who would not speak her name packed food for the riders. Deacon Vance stood in the road and called the hunt an act of mercy. Silas mounted at the head of it. He told Elias and Caleb quietly that Clara was confused, that Chato had poisoned her against them, and that the journals must be recovered before anyone else read them. "Bring her back alive," he said. Then he looked at his brothers long enough for them to understand the rest. By noon, a line of dust rose from Bitter Creek and followed Clara into the hills. By the second day, Chato had stopped teaching Clara with explanations and begun teaching her with silence. At a creek no wider than a wagon, he crossed once, then turned and pointed to the water. Clara stepped in. The shock of cold reached her knees. The current tugged at the shortened hem of her skirt. "Again," he said. She crossed back, wrong. "I reached the other side. So will the men behind us." He showed her how to enter downstream, walk backward through the shallows, then leave on stone rather than mud. He showed her where a broken reed betrayed a body that had passed, and how sunlight made the underside of turned pebbles shine darker than those undisturbed. He made her cross the creek 3 times until her teeth chattered. "A tracker expects a frightened person to move forward," he said. "Make him read the wrong story." Clara wrung water from her skirt. Silas is excellent at reading the wrong story. Chato gave what might have been the beginning of a smile. They moved west through low country where sage grew waist-high and basalt pushed from the earth in black shelves. The landscape looked empty to Clara at first. By evening it had begun to fill. Rabbit tracks crossed the wash. Ravens circled where something had died. A line of greener grass marked underground water. Wind had direction and temperature. Stone had age. Silence had layers. Near sunset, Chato climbed a ridge and crouched behind a juniper. Clara joined him. Far below, a pale plume of dust moved along the valley floor. The posse? Some of it. Some? Too narrow. 5, maybe 6 riders. The rest returned or split. Clara looked until her eyes watered. "Can you see Silas?" No, that worried her more. They descended into a dry wash before dark. Chato uncovered a small seep beneath a shelf of sandstone by digging away damp gravel with his hands. The water was muddy and tasted of iron. Clara drank it anyway. Later, while she ate dried apple beside a smokeless fire, Chato handed her a gray root with twisted fingers. "Chew, what is it?" "Water you can carry without a cup." It was bitter enough to make her eyes sting, but moisture ran from the fibers as she worked it between her teeth. "Desert root," he said. "Dig under the shadow side of rabbit brush after rain. Not every root. This one." Clara examined the plant by firelight. "My father would have written 6 pages about it." "Did he?" She opened the smallest journal Thomas had. Not 6 pages, but 2. He had described the root as an emergency source of fluid and noted that Apache guides used it when springs failed. Clara read the paragraph twice. He knew. Your father listened. That is different from knowing. Is that praise? It is accuracy. She closed the book. For the first time since leaving Bitter Creek, she slept more than an hour at a stretch. The next afternoon they entered the Salt Canyon proper. The country changed abruptly. Red earth faded into chalky flats that reflected sunlight upward, so the heat seemed to come from both sky and ground. Cliffs rose in bands of cream, rust, and violet. The air smelled of hot mineral dust. Clara's lips cracked despite the water, her repaired boots filled with fine white powder. Chato moved more slowly now. Every few hundred yards he stopped, not from fatigue but to listen. Near a narrow saddle, a sound reached them from behind, a deep, mournful bay. Then another. Clara turned. A dog. Chato's mouth tightened. Bloodhound. The baying came again, faint but unmistakable. "Can we lose it in the creek?" "Not for long." "Then what?" Chato looked toward the cliffs. Clara had already pulled out her father's journal. She remembered a sketch she had noticed the previous night, a ridge drawn as 3 slanting lines with a warning in the margin. Unstable limestone shelf, old water hollow, passable only by light foot. Approach from western face. She turned pages with dirty fingers. Here. Chatto crouched beside her. Thomas had called it the False Ridge. Years earlier, he had used it to reach a prospector with a crushed leg after flooding cut the wagon road. The formation appeared to end against a blank wall, but a narrow traverse continued behind a leaning slab. Horses could not use it. A heavily loaded man should not try. Chatto studied the sketch, then the canyon. Your father drew poorly. Clara stared at him. Is that your professional opinion? Yes. But he saw correctly. They found the leaning slab half a mile later. The path beyond was barely the width of Clara's shoulders. To her right, stone pressed against her ribs. To her left, the canyon dropped hundreds of feet into glare. The wind climbed the cliff and pulled at her clothing. Chatto went first. Look at the rock in front of you, he said. Not the bottom. I was not looking at the bottom. You were thinking about it loudly. Clara swore at him under her breath and followed. Halfway across, the hound reached the base of the cliff. Its baying changed. Excitement became confusion. Men shouted. A horse whinnied. Clara flattened herself against stone while Chatto found the next hold. Below, she caught a glimpse of black cloth. Silas. He stood beside the hound, looking up at a wall he could not imagine she had crossed. The sight gave Clara strength that fear had not. She moved faster. At the far end, Chatto pulled her behind the slab just as the wind shifted. Their scent lifted into the open canyon. The hound barked twice, then fell silent. They did not celebrate. They kept walking. Late that afternoon, the sky darkened from blue to the greenish purple of an old bruise. Chatto smelled the storm before Clara heard it. He caught her arm and ran toward a crack in the canyon wall. The first blast of wind hit as they reached it. Sand came sideways. Within seconds, the world disappeared. They wedged themselves into the rock split shoulder to shoulder. Dust streamed past the opening with a sound like a train. Clara tried to breathe through her sleeve and began coughing at once. Chatto pulled something white from inside his vest, a piece of her veil. She recognized the floral pattern even in the dim light. Where did you get that? From your fence. You kept it? It was cloth. He folded it several times, dampened it from his canteen, and pressed it over her mouth and nose. The answer should not have moved her. It did. The same lace Bitter Creek had used to make her publicly ashamed now filtered grit from her lungs. There was no lesson in it that needed words. Chatto saw material where the town had seen symbol. Under pressure, utility had become a kind of mercy. The crevice was too narrow for distance. Clara's shoulder pressed against his chest. Each gust pushed them deeper into the stone. He leaned his forehead against hers so they could share the limited space behind the wet cloth. They breathed in the same rhythm. For hours there was nothing else. When the storm finally weakened, the desert outside had changed shape. Their tracks were gone. Dunes had shifted across the flats. The sun hung pale behind suspended dust. Clara took 4 steps into the light and collapsed. Heat and thirst rearranged her mind. She knew she was on the ground, yet she also stood again on the church steps. Deacon Vance's face floated above a white landscape. Silas spoke from somewhere near her ear. You were made for rooms, Clara. You were made to be kept. Look what happens when you mistake stubbornness for strength. She tried to crawl away. A hand caught her shoulder. She struck at it weakly. Clara, not Silas. Chatto rolled her onto her back and shaded her face with his body. His expression changed when he saw how dry her mouth was. He took out a piece of desert root, sliced it, chewed the fibers, then pressed the wet pulp between her lips. Under other circumstances, she might have recoiled. There were no other circumstances. She swallowed. The juice was bitter mineral alive again. He fed her until her vision steadied. Clara gripped his forearm. Do not tell anyone I ate something you chewed first. I will announce it in Bitter Creek. She blinked, unsure whether fever had invented the joke. Chatto's face remained perfectly serious. Clara laughed until it became a cough. They rested in the shade until evening. By moonrise they had reached an abandoned cliff dwelling high above the flats. Stone rooms had been built into a natural alcove. Doorways were low. Smoke had blackened the ceilings. Broken pottery lay near the walls, and a faint red handprint remained on a patch of clay beside one entrance. Clara set her palm over it. The old print was smaller, but the fingers aligned closely enough to make her chest tighten. Who lived here? People who left before Bitter Creek existed. Why? Many reasons. Drought, war, hunger. Men who wanted what was theirs. Chatto sat near the terrace edge. The basin has always taken people who had nowhere else to stand, not only Apache. Not only white, people erased by towns, armies, families, debts. Some stay one winter, some stay forever. Clara looked back at the handprint. So it is a hiding place. No, it is hidden. That is not the same thing. He took a strip of dried meat from his bag. A hiding place is where you wait for the world to call you back. The basin is where you stop waiting. The word sat with her long after Chato went to sleep. Clara lit one candle and opened Thomas's journal. She had read the names of Silas's patients, but not every surrounding note. Here, with the canyon silent below, she followed one case from beginning to end. Sarah Bell, 26, wife of a laborer. A simple abdominal procedure had become catastrophic when Silas operated after drinking. Thomas arrived to find Sarah bleeding and Silas unable to control his hands. Deacon Vance came before the body was cold. He convinced Sarah's husband that she had suffered an unforeseeable heart failure. The death record was altered. In return, the church fund paid the husband's overdue mortgage. Clara read the final line twice. Town accepted account because alternative would threaten confidence in only young physician available through winter. She sat back against the stone. That was the shape of it. Bitter Creek had not shunned her simply because Silas was powerful. The town had participated in protecting him because admitting the truth would force people to admit their own choices. They had trusted him with children, childbirth, gunshot wounds, fevers. They had accepted convenient explanations. Some had benefited from the cover-ups. Others had been too afraid to ask questions. Clara was dangerous because she made the lie visible. The unveiling had not been moral judgment. It had been containment. She closed the book and stared into the dark. Chato spoke without opening his eyes. Heavy? What? Truth. Clara looked at the journal on her knees. Very. Then do not carry more of it than you need. These books may be the only way to expose him. Maybe. You say that as if it does not matter. Chato opened his eyes. So does water. So do your feet. So does tomorrow morning. A truth that kills the person carrying it does not become more true. Clara did not like the answer. That did not make it wrong. At dawn they moved again. Behind them, Elias and Caleb Montgomery found the place where the storm had scattered tracks and where the hound lost scent beneath the false ridge. Silas split from them with two riders, gambling on an eastern trail that might reach Eagle's Rib sooner. Elias and Caleb remained on the western route with the dog. Caleb found Clara's pearl button near an old campsite. He rolled it between his fingers and smiled. Elias noticed. What? Nothing. Caleb put the button in his pocket. He enjoyed the hunt differently from his brother. Elias wanted the insult corrected. Caleb wanted to see what happened when a woman who had been protected all her life lost every layer of protection. The cruelty was quieter in him, and for that reason, more dangerous. 2 days later, Clara saw their dust from a ridge. They are still coming, she said. Yes, the dog too? Chato watched the movement below. No dog. Why? Maybe Silas took it east. Maybe it died. Maybe they learned they do not need it. Clara's eyes went to the bundle tied behind their pack horse. Most of her wedding dress remained wrapped around the journals, but a large outer skirt still traveled with them because Chato had used it at night as an extra layer against cold. She looked toward a box canyon opening to the south. They expect to see me. Yes. Then let them. An hour later, they built a bride. Clara draped the white silk over a frame of dry yucca stalks wedged among rocks near the end of the box canyon. From a distance, heat shimmer turned the fabric into a kneeling figure. She tied a scrap of veil to a sun-bleached hat and tilted the head as if in exhaustion. Chato watched her work. You are enjoying this. A little. Good. They climbed to a shelf above the canyon and waited. Elias and Caleb appeared near midday. From their angle, the false bride was a white shape in a world of red and gray. Elias raised his Winchester. The shot cracked through the canyon. Caleb fired a heartbeat later. Silk jumped. Dust burst from the rock. Both brothers advanced slowly, confident enough to savor the end. Then the dust cleared. Caleb reached the figure first. He pulled the dress from the yucca frame and stared through 2 fresh bullet holes. Above, Clara saw his face change. Elias swore so loudly the word carried to the ridge. Chato had already wedged a cedar branch beneath a slab of rotten limestone. He looked at Clara. The question in his eyes was clear. If they released the rock, the brothers might be injured. They might be killed. At minimum, the exit would close. Clara put both hands on the lever. Do it, they pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the mountain groaned. The slab shifted and took half the shelf with it. Rock and shale poured into the canyon mouth. Elias and Caleb ran as the ground exploded behind them. A wall of dust rose high enough to hide the sun. When it settled, the exit was buried under 20 feet of broken stone. The brothers were alive. Clara could hear them coughing and cursing. She felt no disappointment. "That bought us a day," Chato said. "Only a day?" "Maybe two if Elias spends time blaming Caleb." Below, shouting began. Clara smiled grimly. Then, too, they turned toward the higher country. That evening, Chato sat beside a small fire repairing a split in his moccasin. The leather had worn through the heel. He pushed a blunt needle at it twice and set the work aside. Clara held out her hand. "Give it to me. You need sleep. You need a heel." The linen thread in her sewing kit was nearly gone. She looked at the journal. Thomas had bound several inserted reports with waxed surgical thread. Clara opened one concerning Silas's earliest recorded mistake, cut the binding carefully, and pulled out a length strong enough for leather. Chato watched. "You are taking apart your proof. One thread. Today." Clara threaded the curved surgical needle. "If the man carrying me through a canyon cannot walk because I wanted a perfect book, the book wins and we lose." She stitched the moccasin in the firelight. The irony did not escape her. She was using the physical structure of Silas's record to keep moving away from him. When she tied the final knot, Chato inspected the repair. Ugly. "It will hold, still ugly. Give it back, I will undo it." He put the moccasin on. Too late. The quiet that followed felt different from the silence in Bitter Creek. It asked nothing of her. After a while, Clara said, "Why did the army stop using you as a scout?" Chato's hands stilled. For a long time she thought he would not answer. "They did not stop," he said finally. "I stopped." He stared into the fire. Years earlier, he had guided soldiers through country the officers did not understand. At first he believed the work could prevent fighting. He could show them water, warn them away from camps, translate before rifles spoke. Then a captain ordered him to lead a detachment through a hidden pass toward families who had been promised safety. Chato refused. The army called him unreliable, then disloyal. His papers disappeared. Pay owed to him was withheld. Rumors replaced records. "They wanted my eyes until I saw something they did not want seen," he said. Clara thought of Thomas's journals. "Then we were both punished for noticing." Most systems forgive cruelty faster than witnesses. She looked at him across the fire. "Is that why you helped me?" He did not answer immediately. "Partly," the same word he had used at her porch. Before she could ask more, he stood. "Sleep. We climb before sunrise." The next morning, a rattlesnake struck from a crack in the limestone. Clara heard the dry rattle, saw Chato shift his foot, and believed he had avoided it. He kept walking. For nearly an hour, nothing seemed wrong. Then Clara noticed the sound. His right step landed cleanly. His left dragged by half an inch. Click, scrape, click, scrape. She had spent days following his feet. The altered rhythm was as obvious to her now as a missed note on a piano. "Stop," Chato continued. He turned. His face had gone gray around the mouth. Clara looked at his leg. A dark stain marked the buckskin above his ankle. "Sit down, we move. Sit down or I will knock you down." He almost smiled. Then his knees buckled. Clara caught his shoulder and lowered him under the thin shade of a cedar. The bite had swollen quickly. 2 punctures were visible above the ankle. Fear rose in her, but it was not the shapeless fear of the church steps. This fear had tasks attached. She opened the medical kit. Thomas had written about snakebite more than once. Some of his methods were old, some experimental, all limited by what medicine could actually do. Clara cleaned the wound, loosened the tight leather around the swelling, used cool cloths, rationed water, and kept Chato as still as she could. She did not attempt the dramatic remedies Silas favored in public demonstrations. No deep cutting, no frantic sucking at the wound, no whiskey poured down a patient's throat to make everyone feel useful. "You knew," she said as she worked. "You knew it struck you. Yes, and you kept walking. Yes, that was stupid. Yes." Clara looked up, startled by the agreement. "You could have died. Still can." "Do not say that. You want an honest promise or a comforting one?" She hated that he had remembered her own demand at the porch. "I want you to stay awake." "That I can try." By sunset, fever had taken him. They sheltered in a narrow pocket under rock. Clara fed him water a mouthful at a time and replaced damp cloths when they warmed against his skin. She crushed desert root and a few herbs Chato had identified earlier, using them for moisture and cooling rather than pretending they were magic. Near midnight, he began speaking in fragments. Some words were Apache, some were English. Then he said her name. "You were there," Clara said. "At my house before the lanterns?" His eyes opened but did not fully focus, long before. Why? Watching Montgomery. The answer came slowly. Chato had been near Bitter Creek for months, gathering information about land claims and water routes. Thomas Thorne's old notes had led him there. He had watched Silas visit the Thorne house. He had seen Clara at the clinic. He had seen the church crowd gather for the unveiling from a ridge beyond the cemetery. You watched them tear it? Yes. Clara did not know whether to feel exposed or understood. Why didn't you help me then? Chato's gaze sharpened for a moment. Because then you would have called for them to save you from me. The truth of it hurt. A week earlier, she might have. He closed his eyes again. I knew the look, he murmured. The one after. When people decide there is no ground under your feet. My mother had it when soldiers moved us. Men had it when the army took names from lists. You had it by the fence. Clara sat very still, so the journals were not the only reason. No, and the land records. Real. You are impossible, even with fever. His mouth moved slightly. Good. Means I am not dead. For the rest of the night, Clara watched his breathing. At dawn, the fever was still there, but no worse. She took Chato's knife and practiced the draw he had shown her until her forearm ached. She learned the balance, the reach, the way to keep the blade close rather than waving it like a threat. She was not becoming fearless. She was becoming useful. By the second evening, Chato could stand. By the third morning, he could walk. Slowly. Eagle's rib rose ahead of them like the spine of some buried animal. Beyond it lay the hidden basin. And somewhere on the other side, Silas Montgomery was waiting. The air changed as they climbed. Salt heat fell away behind them. Pine appeared in scattered pockets. Patches of old snow survived beneath northern ledges, dirty and hard as bone. The wind smelled of resin, cold stone, and distant water. Chato should have been moving faster in his own country. Instead, every 100 yards he paused, long enough to hide the effort of breathing. Clara said nothing about it. His pride had already cost him once. She had learned that arguing with it directly only made it harder. So she found reasons to stop that belonged to her. My boot, she said at the first shelf, though nothing was wrong with it. They rested. I need water, she said near a cedar grove. Though she had drunk 10 minutes before, they rested again. At the third stop, Chato looked at her. Your boot is very sick. Dying, tragic. I appreciate your concern. The corner of his mouth moved. Then the expression vanished. He lifted one hand. Ahead, above the trail, sunlight flashed on metal. Clara's fingers went to the knife at her belt. A man stepped onto a narrow shelf 50 yards higher. Black coat. Brass rifle fitting. Clean collar, though the rest of him was dusted gray. Silas. He had lost his horse somewhere below. His hair had come loose at the temples, and his face was leaner than when Clara last saw him on her porch. Yet he still stood as if the mountain were an examination room he controlled. Clary May, he called. Clara's stomach turned. Her father had used that name when she was small. No one else had been permitted to. Silas must have heard Thomas Sawus and stored it away for a moment like this. Come home. The words echoed between rocks. Chato leaned against a cedar, rifle lowered but ready. He talks to a ghost, he said. Clara watched Silas. Yes. Silas raised his hands to show he meant peace, though his rifle rested within reach. I have told everyone what happened, he called. They know you were taken. They know grief made you vulnerable. The town is prepared to forgive everything. Vance will end the shunning publicly. You can walk back into Bitter Creek without shame. Clara almost admired the construction. He had made himself generous in a story where he had marked her house for predators. And Chato? She shouted. Silas's gaze moved to the scout as if noticing a stain. He will answer for what he has done. He helped me leave. You don't know what you are saying. I asked him. Silas's mouth tightened. That is what you believe now. There it was. The trick beneath every offer. Her memory was a symptom. Her decision was illness. Her refusal was proof she needed control. Clara felt no anger at first, only exhaustion. What do you want, Silas? You, no. The answer surprised him. You want the journals. His expression changed. Only slightly, but enough, Clara continued. You could have come alone to save me. You brought rifles. Your brothers vandalized my father's office. You marked my fence. You blocked my food. You wrote a schedule for my life before I agreed to it. Everything you call rescue is another way to get the books. Those books are the ramblings of a sick old man. Then why are you here? Wind moved through the pines. Silas did not answer. Clara heard another sound beneath it, a branch snapping lower on the slope, then one to the east. Chato heard it too. Elias and Caleb. Silas was not alone. Chato's condition made a direct fight impossible. Clara could see tremor returning to his left hand. The pass above was narrow, but they would have to cross open ground to reach it. She looked at the remains of their last campfire in a rock hollow, cold gray ash. An idea formed. "Can you climb to the shelf above him?" she whispered. Shadow followed her glance. "Slowly. Slowly is enough if he watches me. And if his brothers come from below, then they watch me too." He studied her face. "You are planning something bad. I learned from respectable men." Clara knelt and pushed both hands into the ash. She smeared soot over her cheeks, nose, and forehead, dulling the pale skin that flashed against stone. She removed the last dark shawl, rolled it, and wedged the journal bundle inside a hollow beneath a fallen log. "If they catch me," she said, "they do not get the books." Chato's eyes hardened. "If they catch you, they won't. That is not an honest promise." She looked at him. "Then I will do everything I can to make it true." That he accepted, Silas called again. "Clara," she stepped into view. "I'm coming up." Relief softened his posture. He believed her. Clara walked 3 slow steps toward the main trail, then turned sharply and ran into a thicket of mountain mahogany. Silas shouted. A rifle cracked from below. The bullet struck stone well to her right. She ducked, climbed through brush, and slipped into a narrow chute between boulders. Behind her she heard Elias cursing and Caleb moving faster, lighter. Silas did not shoot. He still needed her alive. That was one advantage she could trust. Clara crawled through the chute and emerged behind a shelf of pale limestone. Through gaps in the brush, she saw Chato climbing above, moving painfully but silently. A shadow crossed below, Caleb. He was closer than she expected. Clara held her breath. He paused beside the boulder and looked toward the trail. The pearl button from her old dress hung on a leather thong around his neck. The sight chilled her more than the rifle in his hands. He had made a keepsake of the hunt. Clara's fingers closed around a fist-sized stone. Caleb stepped nearer. She threw the stone down the opposite side of the chute. It bounced twice. Caleb turned toward the noise. Clara slipped behind him and climbed. By the time he realized the mistake, she had reached the next shelf. "You little." His shot tore through a pine branch. Clara ran bent over until the slope steepened enough to give cover. Chato reached the high shelf at the same time. For a moment they were together behind a limestone spur. "Caleb has a button from my dress around his neck," Clara whispered. Chato's expression became very still. Later. "I know." Below, Elias shouted orders. Silas told them not to fire unless they had a clear shot at Chato. Clara opened her father's medical kit. "What are you doing?" She took out the concave examination mirror. Sunlight blazed from the western sky. Seeing, she crawled to the edge. Elias moved below through scattered juniper, rifle raised. Clara angled the mirror until a small white disk of light danced across rock. She adjusted by inches. The beam struck Elias full in the face. He shouted and threw up one. His rifle fired into the air. Chato shot once, not at Elias but at the stone beside Caleb, forcing him behind cover. Clara flashed the mirror again. Elias stumbled backward. "She's up there." "I know where she is," Silas yelled. "Then do something." The unity among them was breaking. That mattered. Clara slid the mirror into her pocket and moved higher. They reached a shelf where the trail narrowed between a wall and a drop. Elias emerged 20 paces below, squinting, eyes streaming. He leveled a revolver at Clara. "Look at you," he said. His voice was breathless with rage. "You look like one of them, dirt on your face. Legs wrapped in rags, crawling through rocks with a heathen. Your father would spit at the sight." Clara stood behind a waist-high stone, breathing hard. "My father trusted Apache guides more than he trusted your brother. I have his notes. Your father went soft before he died. Your brother let Martha die." Elias froze. It was a gamble. Clara had read the entry but had not meant to use it until necessary. Now necessity stood 20 paces away with a revolver. "What did you say?" "Martha Montgomery. 3 winters ago, your cousin. Elias's gun dipped by an inch. She was sick. She had a blockage. My father offered Silas an instrument to relieve it. Silas refused because he had never used the procedure and would not admit it in front of your family. She drowned in her own fluid while he waited." "Shut your mouth." He wrote it down. "Shut it. He told you God took her because it was easier than telling you he was afraid to look ignorant." Elias raised the revolver again, but his hand had begun to shake. Footsteps scraped behind him. Silas appeared. "She's lying," he said at once, too quickly. Elias turned his head. "Is she? Thomas hated me. You know that. I know Martha was awake when you went into that room. I know she was dead when you came out. She was dying before I arrived. She says there was something you could have done. She says whatever keeps that savage from abandoning her. Clara saw it happen. A hairline crack in a structure that had seemed solid all her life. Elias did not believe her completely. He no longer believed Silas completely either. That was enough. Caleb came up behind them. We can argue after we have the book. His gaze found Clara. Where is it? There was no pretense of rescue in his voice. Elias heard it. He looked from Caleb to Silas. So that is what this is. Silas snapped, "Don't be stupid. The books contain private medical information about half the valley. We cannot let an unstable woman carry them into a lawless camp. You told us we were saving her. We are. Caleb just asked for the book, because the book is part of the problem." Clara took one step backward toward Chato. Silas noticed, "Don't move." The revolver came up. Chato raised his rifle. Caleb swung toward him. 4 people held weapons. Elias stood between sides, his face working, as if he could force the old world back into place by refusing to choose. Then thunder rolled across the range. No clouds stood overhead. The sound came from the east, rockfall. The mountain had shifted somewhere below, perhaps loosened by the earlier storm. Every eye moved for half a heartbeat. Chato grabbed Clara's arm. They ran. The final ascent of Eagle's Rib was not a trail so much as a crack in the mountain wide enough for hands and feet. Chato climbed first. Clara followed directly beneath him. Loose shale rattled down from their boots. Her arms shook from fatigue. The air thinned. Each breath scraped her throat. Below, Silas shouted. He had left his brothers arguing and was climbing after them. Clara did not look down until they reached a narrow outcrop halfway up. Silas was closer than she expected. He climbed badly but desperately, using strength without technique. Twice his polished boots slipped. Once he struck his knee hard enough to cry out. "He is going to kill himself," Clara said. Chato looked down. "Maybe. I don't want that." "Then keep climbing." The answer was not cruel. It was simply the only thing they controlled. They climbed. Near the summit, Chato's injured leg failed. His foot slipped from a shallow hold. Clara heard the scrape and saw his body swing away from the rock. She caught the back of his belt with one hand. Pain tore through her shoulder. For a second, his full weight pulled against her. "Find a hold." Chato's fingers searched stone. Clara's boots slid. She thought of the church steps, of the way she had stood perfectly still while other people decided what she was. Not now. She jammed her left knee into a crack, ignored the skin tearing beneath cloth, and hauled upward. Chato found stone. They stayed there panting, foreheads against rock. "You caught me," he said. "Do not sound surprised. I am impressed by your sick boot." Clara laughed once despite herself. Then a bullet struck the rock below them. Silas had found his revolver again. They moved. The summit opened suddenly. One moment Clara was inside a vertical chimney of stone. The next she stood on a wind-scoured ridge under a huge sky. Beyond the spine of Eagle's Rib, the land fell into green, the hidden basin. Willows traced water. Cedar smoke lifted from somewhere below. A patchwork of cultivated ground lay tucked between limestone walls. After weeks of red stone and white salt, the sight of living green was almost painful. Clara could smell damp earth. They had reached it. Then Silas stepped onto the ridge from the eastern spur. Clara stared. He had somehow cut around while they climbed the final chimney, using a longer but less vertical path known from old ranch maps. He looked half dead. His coat was torn. Blood darkened one cuff where rock had cut him. His revolver was still steady. "Enough," he said. Chato moved in front of Clara. Silas laughed without humor. "Do you think he can protect you? He can barely stand." "He does not own me," Clara said. "Neither do I." "Then put down the gun." Silas's eyes flicked toward her hands. "Where are the journals?" Clara said nothing. "Where are they?" "So much for me being the thing you came to rescue." He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, some final layer of performance had gone. "You have no idea what those books can do. I know exactly what they can do. They can destroy confidence in every physician in the valley. They can reopen deaths that are finished. They can set families against families. They can ruin men who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. They can ruin you. I made mistakes." The word surprised her. Silas continued quickly. "Every doctor makes mistakes. Your father did. I know because I read some of his old files. Men died under his care too. The difference is that Thomas had the luxury of age. People called his failures tragedy. They would call mine murder because I am a Montgomery and because you want revenge." For the first time, Clara heard something almost truthful beneath his defense. Silas had been afraid of failure long before he became monstrous in hiding it. Perhaps the town's worship had trapped him too. but he had responded by trapping everyone else. "Peter Cole," Clara said. Silas's face hardened. "Don't. You gave him morphine after his breathing slowed. He was screaming, and when he stopped breathing, you changed the paper." "Clara, Samuel Reed, 7 years old. Laudanum. The boy had fever for 6 days. Margaret Evans. You left during obstructed labor. I had another patient. Sarah Bell, you had been drinking." Silas flinched. Clara realized she did not need the books in her hands. She had carried these names for days. She knew them. Martha Montgomery. Footsteps stopped behind Silas. Elias and Caleb had reached the ridge. Elias looked exhausted, white dust embedded in his beard. "Say that one again." Silas turned. "Elias, stay out of this." "Say what happened to Martha." Clara met Elias's eyes. She had fluid blocking her airway. My father had a catheter and offered to guide Silas through the procedure. Silas refused. He said intervention would only prolong suffering. My father wrote that Martha could have survived if the blockage had been relieved early. Elias stared at his brother. "You told us there was nothing." "There was no guarantee. You told us there was nothing, because there was no responsible option. Thomas wanted to experiment. Was there a chance?" Silas's silence answered. Elias's face changed. The big man's rage did not explode outward. It seemed to drain him from within. Caleb looked less wounded than calculating. "Is her name actually in the book?" "Yes," Clara said. "Where?" "Page 42 of the second journal." Silas rounded on him. "Why do you care?" Caleb took one step back, "Because if she is telling the truth, we have been chasing her across half the territory to protect you from something you did to our own blood. You have been chasing a stolen woman. She does not look stolen." The sentence fell into the wind. Clara saw Silas understand that he had lost them. Not morally, not completely. Elias and Caleb were still men who had hung red lanterns and hunted her with rifles, but the family machine had cracked. Silas's authority had depended on certainty. Now there was none. His eyes moved from one brother to the other, then to Chatto. Hatred settled on the scout because Chatto was easier to blame than the truth. "You," Silas said. Chatto shifted his weight. "You took her. You filled her head with this. You made her into—" Clara asked. Silas looked at her. He had no word that did not reveal him. Chatto said quietly, "I did not make her." Silas lunged. He moved without warning, abandoning the revolver and throwing himself at Chatto. The two men hit hard. Chatto was stronger and far more skilled, but the snakebite had hollowed him. Silas fought with the panicked strength of a man whose world had narrowed to one enemy. They went down on loose shale, boots and knees grinding stone. Clara moved toward them. Elias caught her arm. She spun with the knife in her hand. He released her immediately. "I'm not stopping you," he said. Caleb stood frozen. Chatto drove an elbow into Silas's shoulder. Silas struck him across the jaw. They rolled toward the edge. The drop beyond was hundreds of feet. Chatto. He caught a rock with one hand. Silas clung to his coat. For a terrible second, both men hung at the lip, legs scrambling for purchase. Clara ran to them. The journal bundle lay where she had dropped it near the climb, silk torn and leather exposed. Silas saw it. His entire face changed. "The books," he gasped. Even with death under his boots, he looked at paper. Clara understood then what she had not fully understood before. As long as she carried the journals, Silas would follow. If not Silas, someone else would come for them. Bitter Creek might someday be forced to apologize. Her father's name might be polished clean. She might stand again in a church, filled with people who had watched her starve, and hear them say they had been wrong. The thought felt empty. Chato's fingers slipped on the rock. Silas reached toward the bundle. "Give them to me," he shouted. "I can fix this. I can still give you your house back. Your name, everything." Clara looked beyond him at the green basin. Then she picked up the journals. Thomas's leather bindings were warm from the sun. She thought of his hand on hers when she learned to count a pulse. She thought of the hidden floorboard, the ink, the names, the fear he had carried alone. He had made the record so truth would survive him. It had. The truth was in her now. Clara swung the bundle outward and released it into the gorge. For a heartbeat, the book seemed to hang in the air. Then the silk opened, pages broke loose and flashed white in the wind. Silas made a sound Clara had never heard from a human throat. He let go of Chatto. Not entirely. Just enough to reach after the falling journals. His boot slipped. Chatto rolled sideways onto solid ground. Silas clawed at shale. One hand caught the edge, then lost it. He fell. The first impact came 50 feet below, a heavy thud against a rock shelf. His body stopped there, twisted across stone. A single page from one journal had caught in a scrub bush beside him. No one spoke. Elias walked to the edge and looked down. He removed his hat. Clara expected him to call for rope. He did not. The shelf below was reachable with great risk. Silas might already have been dead. Elias stood there for a long time, shoulders bent, and Clara saw the true end of the Montgomery power, not his brother's fall, this. The moment Elias decided not to risk himself for the man whose lies had used them all, Caleb lowered his rifle. The pearl button still hung at his throat. Clara pointed to it. "Take that off." Caleb's hand rose automatically. For once, the sly smile did not come. He pulled the thong over his head and dropped the button in the dust. Clara stepped on it as she passed. Elias picked up his hat, looked at it, then let it fall too. "What happens now?" he asked. "Clara, you go back. And say what? Whatever truth you can live with." He gave a bitter laugh. "Vance won't believe me. That used to matter to me." Elias looked at her as if trying to locate the woman he had known. He could not. "Martha," he said. Was she afraid? Clara's anger almost answered first. Then she remembered the entry. My father wrote that she asked for her mother. He stayed with her after Silas left the room. She was not alone at the end. Elias closed his eyes. "Thank you." Clara did not say he was forgiven. She was not sure he was. He and Caleb turned back toward Bitter Creek. They walked because their horses were gone and because no family name could carry them now. Chatto sat on the ground near the edge, one hand pressed to his ribs. Clara knelt beside him. "Anything broken? Pride. That may be fatal. For some men," she touched the swelling along his jaw. "Can you stand? If your boot can." Then she laughed. The sound surprised them both. Chatto took the canteen from his belt and handed it to her. No speeches followed, no declaration that justice had been done. Silas was dead. The journals were gone. The town remained behind them, with all its fear and complicity. There would be no courtroom where Thomas Thorne's careful handwriting forced every liar to bow his head. Clara drank water and looked at the green below. She felt grief. For her father, for Peter Cole, for Martha. Even in a distant way, for the man Silas might have been before terror of failure rotted him from the inside. But she did not feel regret. The path into the basin began on the other side of the ridge. Clara and Chatto started down before dark. The first thing Clara noticed about the hidden basin was the smell. Wet earth. After weeks of alkali dust, hot stone, sweat, leather, and smoke, the scent of water and soil stopped her halfway down the switchback. She closed her eyes. Below, a spring emerged from beneath a limestone wall and widened into a shallow pool ringed by willow. Small irrigation channels carried water toward patches of squash, beans, and late corn. Cedar roofs showed between trees. Some dwellings were built of mud and poles. Others had been cut into natural recesses in the rock. Smoke rose blue and straight in the evening air. Children were shouting near the water. The ordinary sound of them almost broke her. Chatto paused beside her. "Can you walk?" "Yes, that was not what I asked." Clara looked down at her trembling legs. Probably. Better. They descended. No one rushed toward them. No one demanded an explanation. People looked up from work, saw Chatto, saw Clara, and returned to what they were doing after a nod or a lifted hand. That lack of spectacle felt like kindness. Near a stone forge, a broad-shouldered man hammered a horseshoe against an anvil. Clara recognized him after 3 strikes. "Mr. Miller?" The hammer stopped. The man turned. His beard was streaked with gray now, but Clara knew the scar above his right eyebrow. Daniel Miller had been Bitter Creek's blacksmith when she was a child. He had supposedly drowned during the flood of '78 after a dispute over a ranch boundary. Deacon Vance had preached his funeral without a body. Miller stared at Clara, then at Chatto. Thomas Thorne's girl. Clara's old instinct made her stiffen. Miller set down the hammer. "Your father stitched my hand when a shoeing nail went through it. Wouldn't take payment because I'd fixed his wagon axle the winter before." He lifted the hand. A pale scar crossed the palm. "Sorry about him." Clara swallowed. "Thank you." That was all. No question about the broken engagement. No look at her torn clothes. No whisper of scandal. Farther along, a woman sat under a cedar awning weaving split willow. Clara knew her too, though it took longer. Miss Hester Wynne had taught school in Bitter Creek before vanishing with what the town called a traveling gambler. Clara remembered women speaking about the disappearance in tones that mixed pity and satisfaction. Hester looked up and smiled. "They said you ran away with a gambler." Clara said before she could stop herself. "Did they?" "Yes. That's more interesting than what happened." "What happened?" "I found out Vance was using school funds to cover land taxes for 3 families who voted the way he wanted. I said I would show the accounts to the territorial superintendent. 2 nights later, my room caught fire. I left before the second accident. She returned to the basket. There was a gambler for about 6 months later, though. Terrible cook. Very pretty hands. Clara laughed, then covered her mouth because the sound felt strange in her own body. Hester smiled wider. You'll fit. An older woman approached from the spring carrying a ceramic bowl and folded clothing. Her hair was iron gray, braided down her back. The skin of her face had been carved by sun and time, yet her eyes were clear and direct. Chato greeted her in Apache. She answered, looked at Clara, and said in English, "Sit." Clara sat on a flat stone because she had no strength left for dignity. The woman dipped linen into the bowl and began cleaning Clara's face. The water was cold. Clara flinched. Good, the woman said. You feel it. Chato moved away to speak with Miller. Who are you? Clara asked. Miriam. Clara blinked. Mother Miriam? The woman gave her a suspicious look. Some call me that. There was a Mother Miriam in Bitter Creek. She baked bread for church suppers. Different Miriam. Probably better bread. Clara laughed again. This Miriam washed the dust from Clara's temples, neck, hands, and forearms with brisk efficiency. Gray water ran from the cloth. She examined the burns on Clara's fingers from the red lantern, the cuts on her knee from the climb, and the raw places at her heels. You need sleep. Food first, then sleep. Tomorrow we see what else you need. She unfolded the clothing, buckskin leggings, a simple tunic, a soft shirt of woven cotton patched at one elbow. Clara looked down at what remained of her old dress. Silk showed in strips beneath dirt. The shortened skirt had been repaired with wool, buckskin, and pieces of itself until no seam belonged to the original design. She stood behind a willow screen to change. For a moment she held the ruined dress in both hands. She remembered the cedar box from Philadelphia, her father's smile, the seamstress's careful fittings, the church steps, the decoy shot full of holes, the strips wrapped around her ankles. No single meaning remained in the cloth. That pleased her. She folded it once and placed it beside the spring. Then she put on the buckskin. The leggings moved when she moved. The shirt did not restrict her ribs. The tunic smelled of wood smoke and sage. When she stepped out, Miriam handed her a cup of hot cedar root tea. Bitter, Clara said after tasting it. Most useful things are. That is not medically true. Miriam raised one eyebrow. Then you are healthy enough to argue. Clara drank. That night she slept in a small room carved into the rock near the spring. She woke once before dawn and did not know where she was. Her hand reached for journals that no longer existed. Panic came instantly. Samuel Reed, Margaret Evans, Sarah Bell, Martha Montgomery. The names surfaced in her mind. She whispered them until her heartbeat slowed. Paper was gone. Memory remained. In the morning, Chato was not outside her door. Clara felt a foolish stab of alarm. Miriam, grinding corn nearby, noticed. He went to sleep. Where? His place. He should be watched after that bite. He has been watched. By whom? Miriam pointed to herself. Clara realized she had assumed Chato belonged to her problem, simply because he had carried her through it. The thought embarrassed her. I should check the wound. Later. First you eat. I am a medical. Clara stopped. What was she? Not a licensed physician. Women rarely were, and no territorial board had ever examined her. She had assisted her father for years, knew anatomy, doses, dressings, childbirth, fever management. In Bitter Creek, people had called her help charming when Thomas was present, and improper the moment she claimed authority herself. Miriam watched the question move across her face. First you eat, she repeated. Clara ate. Afterward, she found Chato asleep under a cedar lean-to with one boot off. The bitten ankle remained swollen but had not worsened. She checked his pulse without waking him. Too fast? He asked with his eyes still closed. You are awake now. The swelling is better. Good. You need another day without climbing. He opened one eye. You have been here one night and already give orders. Medical instructions. Worse. Clara sat beside him. For a while they listened to the spring. What happens to Elias and Caleb? She asked. They walk home. And Silas? He stays where he fell until someone goes for him. The bluntness made her wince. Chato turned his head. You wanted a different answer? No. She picked at a loose thread in her new sleeve. I thought I would feel free when he could no longer reach me. Instead, I keep thinking about what the journals could have done. Maybe they would have done what you wanted. Or Vance would have called them forged. Silas would have called my father unstable. The town would have chosen whatever story, let it sleep. Maybe. You say maybe too often. The world does. Clara looked toward the basin. Miller's hammer rang in the distance. Children carried water in small buckets. Hester Wynne hung dyed reeds to dry. I don't know what to do here. Chato closed his eye again. Good. Why is that good? Because no one has written your schedule. Clara thought of Silas's little leather book burning in the stove. She began to smile. Her first week in the basin hurt more than the last week on the trail. Survival while fleeing had been simple. Walk, drink. Hide, climb. Keep Chato breathing. Each problem arrived with edges. Living asked broader questions. No one cared that Clara had been a thorn. That meant no inherited respect, but it also meant no inherited duty. If she wanted food, she worked. If she used water, she helped maintain the channels. If she borrowed a tool, she returned it sharpened or repaired. Miriam put her to work cleaning roots. Clara resented it for half a morning. I know how to dress wounds, she said. So do I. I assisted my father for 14 years. Then you know how to clean roots. Clara stared. Miriam stared back. Clara cleaned roots. By afternoon, she understood the lesson without being told. The basin had healers already. Knowledge was not a throne. If she wanted trust, she would earn it in the same way everyone earned everything else. She carried water. She helped Hester repair roof matting. She learned which mushrooms grew after the rare rains and which gray-green leaves eased stomach cramps. She showed Miller how to sterilize a needle before closing a deep cut on his apprentice's forearm. In return, Miller taught her how to sharpen a blade without ruining its edge. At night, Clara wrote from memory. Paper was scarce. She used scraps first. The blank back of an old freight notice, margins of a discarded army form, pieces torn from flour sacks where charcoal would hold. She did not try to rebuild Thomas's journals exactly. She wrote what mattered for medicine. Dosages, she remembered. Symptoms. Treatments that had worked. Treatments that had failed. Names of plants Chato and Miriam taught her. Warnings. Never let pride delay referral. Never alter an outcome to protect the practitioner. If unsure, say unsure. That last line she underlined once. No sermon, no explanation. A rule for herself. 3 weeks after her arrival, a child developed fever. His name was Tomas, 6 years old, son of a Mexican freighter and an Apache woman, whose family had lived in the basin for years. By evening he was hot enough that his skin seemed to burn through the blanket. Miriam sent for Clara. Not because Clara was now the physician, because she had another set of eyes. The boy coughed, but his lungs sounded relatively clear. His neck was supple, no rash. He complained of pain low on the right side of his belly. Clara pressed gently. Tomas cried out. She stopped. Her father had taught her that pain had geography. He needs to be watched closely, Clara said. No heavy food, water, small amounts often. If the pain moves or the belly becomes hard, we may have a surgical emergency. Miriam nodded. Appendix? Clara looked at her. You know that word? Your people did not invent bellies. Clara flushed. No, they did not. They stayed with Tomas through the night. His pain eased toward dawn. By afternoon, the fever broke. Whatever inflammation had begun did not progress. The boy's mother wept with relief. Clara felt relief too, but it carried a new kind of fear. She understood Silas a little better in that moment. Not his lies, never those, but the temptation that came after being trusted with life. A patient improved, and everyone looked at the healer as if she had commanded it. A patient died, and everyone wanted a reason. It would be easy to start believing the first look and hiding from the second. That evening, Clara added another line to her scraps. A good outcome does not prove you were right. A bad outcome does not excuse a lie. Months passed. Winter entered the basin gently compared with the exposed valley. Snow dusted the high ridges but rarely reached the spring. Clara's hands roughened. Her skin darkened. Her hair, once arranged in elaborate coils, stayed braided down her back or tied at the neck. She stopped counting how often she thought about Bitter Creek. At first it was every hour, then every day. Then a week passed and she realized she had forgotten to hate anyone. News arrived in fragments. A trader came through in late winter with salt and lamp oil. He had heard that Dr. Silas Montgomery died in the mountains while leading a search for his missing fiancée. Deacon Vance preached that the doctor had been murdered by savages. Clara kept sorting bandages. Anything else? She asked. The trader shrugged. His brothers came back walking. Wouldn't support the deacon's story. Elias got drunk at Finch's and said Silas lied about a woman in the family dying. Caleb left town 2 weeks later. Clara's hands paused. Did Elias mention Martha? Maybe that was the name. People started asking questions about old deaths. Vance called it gossip. Didn't help that Finch suddenly remembered seeing Montgomery men put those red lamps around the Thorn place. Funny how memory improves when the richest family stops being rich. The trader laughed. Clara did not. What happened to the thorn house? Still there, empty. Something inside her tightened, then loosened. Good, that was all she wanted to know. The trader left the next morning. Clara never asked anyone to bring more news. Spring came. One evening, Shadow found her repairing a harness strap outside the room she now called hers. He sat on the step without speaking. She handed him the awl. Hold this. He did. Their closeness had grown in the spaces ordinary life allowed. He brought her plants from high country and never called them gifts. She mended his clothing and pretended she would have done the same for anyone whose stitches offended her. He taught her to shoot a rifle properly. She taught him enough about wound cleaning that he stopped packing cuts with whatever cloth happened to be nearest. They argued about weather, horses, roots, and the correct thickness of coffee. No one announced courtship. No deacon witnessed anything. One night during a storm, Shadow stayed on her floor because the roof of his lean-to leaked. By morning his blanket had moved beside hers. Neither discussed it. Weeks later he carved a wooden shelf into the wall for her medical scraps. That was more intimate than any ring Silas had ever offered. Years accumulated not as a grand transformation but as repeated work. Clara became the person people called when a birth stalled, a fever would not break, a horse kick split skin, or an old cough deepened. Miriam remained better with plants. Clara remained better with anatomy and instruments. They disagreed often and learned from each other more often. The basin had no clinic, so they built one. Miller raised the frame from cedar. Hester fitted woven screens over the windows. Shadow hauled flat stone for the floor. Clara constructed shelves from old freight crates and scrubbed them with lye until her hands cracked. On the opening morning, there was no ceremony. A miner arrived with a nail through his boot. Clara removed it and cleaned the wound, and the clinic began. She kept records, not secret ledgers hidden under floorboards. A plain book sat on a shelf where other healers could read it. If she made an error, she wrote the error. If a treatment did nothing, she wrote that too. The habit made her slower, and she believed safer. It also kept Thomas near without turning him into a shrine. Once, after a difficult birth ended with mother and child alive, the father tried to press a silver coin into Clara's hand. She refused twice. On the third attempt, she took it, then used it to buy lamp oil for the clinic. That night, Shadow said, "You are becoming expensive. Good medicine should be. You charged one coin and spent it on everyone. Terrible business model. Your father would approve?" Clara thought about it. He would complain first, then approve. She rarely spoke Thomas's name with pain anymore. 5 years after the ridge, Deacon Vance arrived at the edge of the basin. He did not come willingly. 2 men from a freight caravan found him delirious near the salt flats after his wagon broke an axle. They did not know his history. They only knew the basin had water and a healer. When Clara walked into the clinic and saw him on the cot, she stopped so abruptly the bowl in her hand sloshed. Vance was thinner. His beard had gone almost white. Without a pulpit, black coat, and crowd behind him, he looked like an old man with sunburn and a badly infected leg. His eyes opened, recognition arrived slowly. Then fear. Clara, she set down the bowl. Miriam, now slower but still sharp-eyed, looked between them. "You know him." "Yes." Vance tried to sit up. Pain stopped him. "I did not know this was where. Lie still." The command came from Clara before she had time to decide what she felt. She examined the leg. A gash below the knee had become swollen and hot. Red streaks climbed toward the thigh. Serious infection. How long? 3 days. Fever? Since yesterday. Clara watched every movement. "What are you going to do?" "Clean it. Open the pocket where pus is trapped. Keep you drinking. Pray if you want to." His face tightened at the last words, unsure whether she mocked him. She did not. "Will I lose the leg?" "Maybe." He flinched. Clara remembered Chato saying the same word in the canyon. "The world does. Will I die? Maybe. You could tell me something kinder." "I could. It would not help you." Vance closed his eyes. She treated him. For 3 days he drifted in and out of fever. During one lucid period he tried to speak about the unveiling. Clara stopped him. "Not now. I need to tell you." "No. You need to drink. I was wrong." The words were weak and hoarse. Clara held the cup to his mouth. "Drink. I believed Silas. Drink. I also believed the town needed him. That if people lost faith, you made other people pay for your fear." Vance's eyes filled. "Yes." Clara waited for satisfaction. None came, only tiredness. "Drink." He did. The infection slowly receded. He kept the leg. Before leaving, Vance stood outside the clinic with a cane and looked toward Clara. "I can tell Bitter Creek you saved me. If you want, I can tell them what happened. If you want. You don't care? Clara considered the question. I care whether you tell the truth because truth matters. I don't need you to tell it so I can become who I was. Vance lowered his head. What should I call you? Clara almost said her old name automatically. Then she looked toward Shadow, who stood by the corral mending a bridle. For several years, people in the basin had called her by different names. Clara, doctor's daughter. Root woman, jokingly. Shadow sometimes called her Eyes when she noticed a storm or sick animal before he did. She had never chosen one. Clara is fine, she said to Vance, but it belongs to me now, not to Bitter Creek. He nodded. That answer was enough then. Later, on a ridge above the basin, the question returned. Chato stood beside her, watching sunrise touch the canyon walls. The town gave you names, he said. Bride, liar, unclean, victim. You forgot stubborn. That one was accurate. She bumped his shoulder with hers. He continued. A name should tell truth when possible. What truth do you want yours to tell? Clara looked down at her hands. Scars crossed the fingers. A pale line marked the burn from the red lantern. Another ran over one knuckle from the climb. These hands had held lace, scalpels, rock, root, blood, and water. You once told me the army wanted your eyes until you saw something they did not want seen. Yes. My father wrote because he saw. I survived because I finally learned to see what was in front of me instead of what I was told should be there. She watched a hawk circle over the spring. One who sees. Chato repeated the words softly, first in English, then in his own language. Clara listened to the Apache phrase. Does it mean exactly that? No language means exactly another. Of course you would say that. It is close. Close is enough. 10 winters passed after Eagle's Rib. By then, newcomers to the basin knew Clara first as the healer with the scarred hands and the habit of asking one more question than seemed necessary. Children knew she carried peppermint in a tin for anyone brave during stitches. Adults knew she could be impatient with foolishness and endlessly patient with pain. Chato's hair showed silver at the temples. Miriam pretended not to age and became furious when her knees disagreed. Miller's apprentice took over most work at the forge. Hester taught letters to children under the same cedar awning where she once wove baskets. The basin changed because every refuge that survives eventually becomes a home. New roofs appeared. Irrigation channels lengthened. A second spring was cleared. People came from ranches, reservations, mines, towns, army posts, and places that did not exist on official maps. Some stayed. Some healed and left. No one was asked to confess why the old world had rejected them before receiving water. One late afternoon, a rider entered from the western trail. His horse staggered more than walked. The man fell from the saddle near the well. Clara was in the clinic grinding desert root, with rendered fat for a salve when a boy ran to fetch her. She found the traveler on his back under the cottonwood. His clothes carried the white dust of Salt Canyon. His lips were cracked. Fever had given his eyes a gray shine. On the horse's flank was an old overlapping circle brand, Bitter Creek. Clara knelt. The man's face was familiar, but time had thickened it. She recognized him only when he opened his eyes. Nathan Pike. He had been 14 during the unveiling. One of the boys who later threw stones at the shutter of her medical office and dared each other to touch the red lantern chains. Now he was close to 40 and frightened. Water, he whispered. Clara wet his mouth before allowing him to drink deeply. Slow, he obeyed. She checked his pulse and breathing. Lung fever likely worsened by dehydration and travel. They carried him to the clinic. For 2 days, Nathan drifted between sleep and confusion. Clara treated him with the same methods she would use for anyone else. Fluids, cooling, clean bedding, careful listening to the chest, desert root infusion when his mouth was too dry, and rest. On the 3rd morning, his fever eased. He woke while Clara changed the cloth on his forehead. He stared at her. Recognition slowly widened his eyes. Miss Thorne? Her hand paused. The old name did not hurt. That surprised her. It simply sounded distant, like the name of a town she had once passed through. Drink, she said. Nathan continued staring. You're Clara Thorne. I was. We thought you died. Some people did. His mouth trembled. I was a boy. Clara adjusted the blanket. Yes, I threw. I remember. He looked away. Silence stretched. I'm sorry. Clara believed him. She also realized belief was no longer necessary to her healing. You have a fever. Save your strength. Tears stood in his eyes. Why are you helping me? The question irritated her more than the old memories. Because you are sick. After what we did. If I only treated people who had lived perfectly, I could close the clinic and sleep late. A weak laugh escaped him and became a cough. Clara helped him sit forward until it passed. Later, when he could speak longer, Nathan told her about Bitter Creek. The town had changed after Silas died. Not instantly, not nobly. Elias Montgomery returned from the mountain and drank for weeks before finally speaking at a church meeting. He said Clara had not been kidnapped. He said Silas had pursued her for the journals. He spoke Martha's name in front of everyone and asked Deacon Vance why no one had ever questioned the death. Caleb left the territory. Rumor placed him in Nevada, then California. Arthur Finch admitted that Silas's family threatened his store if he sold supplies to Clara during the shunning. Other neighbors remembered things after that. A death certificate that had seemed strange, a payment from the church fund, a patient Silas refused to discuss. Without the journals, no court ever assembled the whole case. But prestige did not require a court to collapse. People stopped treating Montgomery's certainty as law. Deacon Vance eventually resigned his pulpit and disappeared from town for several years. Nathan did not know where he went during that time. Clara said nothing about treating him. The Thorne house had been sold for taxes, then bought by a widow who turned the front rooms into a boarding house. "Your father's office is still there," Nathan said. "She uses it for storage." Clara pictured the broken mortar, the bent instruments, the floorboard with the hidden cavity. The image came clearly, then passed. "I hope the roof still holds," she said. Nathan stared at her. "That's all? What else should there be? I thought you'd want it back." Clara looked around the clinic. Shelves of herbs and clean cloth, instruments boiled and wrapped, notes anyone could read. Morning light falling across a cedar floor Chatto and Miller had laid with their own hands. "No," she said, "I don't." Nathan stayed 2 more weeks until he could ride. On the morning he left, he stood awkwardly near the spring with his hat in both hands. "What do I tell them?" Clara knew what he meant. Bitter Creek. The people who would ask whether the scandalous doctor's daughter was alive in the wilderness. Whether she had become a captive, a widow, a savage, a saint, a mad woman, or whatever story they needed. She looked toward the ridge. Chatto was coming down with a bundle of cut cedar on his shoulder. He had seen them but did not hurry. "Tell them you found water here," Clara said. Nathan waited. "That's all?" "That is the part that may save someone." He nodded slowly. Then he mounted and rode west. That evening Clara sat on the porch of the cabin she and Chatto had built above the spring. The walls were cedar and stone. A kettle steamed over a small iron stove. A repaired harness hung from one peg. On another hung the strip of white silk Clara had once used over her mouth during the sandstorm. She had found it years earlier in the bottom of Chatto's old pack. He claimed he had forgotten it was there. She did not believe him. The cloth was gray, torn, and useless now. She kept it anyway. Not as a relic of shame, not as a relic of romance, as evidence that objects could change meaning when people did. Chatto set the cedar beside the house and sat next to her. "He leave?" "Yes, alive against considerable odds. Your reputation suffers, terribly." He poured tea into 2 chipped cups. Below, lamps appeared one by one around the basin. None were red. No one had chained them to a fence to mark who deserved protection. They were simply lights beside doors, over work tables near the spring. Clara watched children chase each other between them. "Nathan called me Thorne," she said. Chatto handed her a cup. "Did the name bite?" "No. Then perhaps it learned manners." She smiled. For years Clara had believed freedom would feel like winning an argument. She imagined the town forced to acknowledge she had been right. Silas exposed, Vance silenced. Every neighbor compelled to meet her eyes. Freedom had turned out to be quieter. It was knowing where the clean bandages were in the dark. It was Chatto leaving the best piece of cedar near her stove without mentioning it. It was Miriam criticizing her salve proportions from a chair in the sun. It was a sick man from Bitter Creek arriving without the power to make her become the person he remembered. It was a name that belonged to her because she chose to answer to it. The last light left Eagle's Rib. Somewhere beyond that ridge, Silas Montgomery's bones had long since become part of the same mountain he once believed he could command. The journals had disappeared deeper still. Rain, wind, mice, stone, and time had likely destroyed every page. Clara felt no urge to recover them. The names she needed had been spoken. The lessons she needed had been lived. She rested her scarred hand on the porch rail. Chatto's hand settled beside it, not over it. The distinction still mattered. After a while, Clara moved her fingers until they touched his. Below them, the basin went on with its evening work. The next morning, Clara opened the clinic ledger and entered Nathan Pike's case. She wrote the date he arrived. his temperature by touch and later by thermometer, the condition of his lungs, the amount of water he could keep down, the days of fever, the herbs used only to ease his throat, and the point at which his breathing began to clear. She recorded that no single treatment could honestly be credited with the recovery. At the bottom, she wrote, "Patient departed riding under his own power. Nothing about Bitter Creek, nothing about stones thrown at windows, nothing about apologies. The ledger was for the next healer, not for her pride." A girl named Lena sat across the table rolling bandages. She was 16, daughter of a woman who had come to the basin after a mine owner refused to pay 6 months of wages. Lena had quick hands and the habit of asking questions before Clara finished speaking. "Why do you always write what did not work?" she asked. "Because you will make enough mistakes without repeating mine. Miriam says people remember successes because failures are embarrassing." Miriam is irritatingly correct. From the next room came Miriam's voice. "I heard that." Lena grinned. Clara continued writing. "If I try something and it does nothing, that is information. If I hide it because I want to look clever, then the next person wastes time." Lena glanced at the pale scar across Clara's fingers. "Is that from medicine? No. Knifed? Lantern. How do you get cut by a lantern? You don't. You get burned by one." Lena waited for the rest. Years earlier, Clara would have shaped the story carefully. She might have softened the shame, emphasized Silas's cruelty, made herself more innocent or more heroic, depending on the listener. Now she simply held out her hand. "I tried to break something built stronger than I expected. I used the wrong tool and lost my grip." Lena studied the scar. "That's not a very good story. Most useful stories aren't." Miriam laughed from the next room. Clara closed the ledger. Outside, clouds had gathered over Eagle's Rib. The first summer rain came hard enough to hammer the cedar roof. Children ran into the open shouting, faces lifted. Men abandoned tools to cover grain. Women set pots beneath eaves. The basin, which spent most of the year measuring water by cup and channel, suddenly had more than it could catch. Clara stood in the doorway and smelled wet dust rise from the ground. Chatto appeared through the rain carrying a saddle over one shoulder. "Roof leaks," he said. "Which roof? Ours, your side? There is no my side." "Then why are you smiling?" "Because your side leaks more." They ran uphill together. Water had found a gap around the chimney and was dripping onto the shelf above Clara's bed. She moved the books while Chatto climbed onto a stool with a piece of hide and a hammer. The old strip of veil hung from its peg near the door. A gust blew rain through the open window and soaked it. For an instant, the lace became translucent again. Clara stopped. She could see the old floral pattern clearly. The same small flowers she had counted on the church steps while Deacon Vance tore the veil from her head. 1, 3, 8, 13. The numbers rose automatically. Then Chatto dropped a wooden peg. It bounced off the stove and rolled under the table. "Your hammering is excellent," Clara said. "I did not hammer it. That explains the craftsmanship." The memory released her. She bent to retrieve the peg. By evening, the rain had passed. Water ran full in the channels, carrying pine needles and red silt toward the gardens. Clara went down to help clear debris from the first diversion gate. Lena was already there with Miller's grandson, both shin-deep in muddy water and arguing about who had blocked the channel with a branch. Clara stepped in beside them. No one treated the healer as too important to move mud. She preferred it that way. When the channel cleared, water rushed forward and spread into the bean rows. People cheered for no reason beyond relief. Clara stood wet to the knees, hair coming loose from its braid, and watched the dark soil drink. She thought briefly of Bitter Creek's church steps under the hard Arizona sun. She could still reconstruct every face if she tried. Finch, Mrs. Pike, Vance, Silas, Elias, Caleb. She could still hear the lace tear, but memory no longer felt like a room she had been locked inside. It was simply a place she knew how to leave. Lena splashed past carrying a shovel. "Clara, the lower gate is jammed." Clara turned immediately. "Use the long pry bar. Don't put your fingers under it." "I know. Knowing has never stopped anyone from doing something foolish." Shado, standing on the bank, said, "She has learned from you." Clara threw a handful of muddy water at him. He stepped aside too late. The children saw and decided this permitted general war. For several chaotic minutes, the irrigation ditch became useless for anything except laughter. Later, when darkness settled and the lamps came on, Clara returned to the porch with mud drying on her skirt. Chatto brought 2 cups of coffee. Miriam's voice carried from a neighboring cabin as she scolded someone for wasting good firewood. Somewhere near the spring, Lena was reciting the steps for cleaning a wound to a younger child who had scraped his knee. Clara listened. Clean hands first. Clean water. Look before touching. Say what you know. Say what you do not know. The sequence was not exactly how Clara taught it, but the important parts had survived. She rested her head against the cedar post. A life could be carried that way, she thought. Not as a monument. Not as a name polished by people who once refused to speak. In habits. In work. In the next pair of hands, knowing where to press, when to stop, and when to admit uncertainty. Chato sat beside her. Neither of them watched the Western Trail. There was nothing coming from Bitter Creek that Clara needed in order to begin again.